Welcome to Tactical Talk. This is Zain Khan. Today's topic revolves around the Multipolar Alliance. What is the Multipolar Alliance? To discuss this topic, we have with us today, joining us from Canada, Matthew Ehret, a political and geopolitical analyst and author, and also a social commentator. Welcome to our show, Matthew. This is Zain Khan. It's a pleasure having you on Tactical Talk.
Thank you.
Joining us, Jeff J. Brown, a senior geopolitical analyst, a best-selling author of the book, The China Trilogy, also the editor of China Rising Radio, Sinoland, and China Tech News. He is an authority on the subject. Welcome to our show, Jeff. This is Zain Khan. It is a pleasure having you on Tactical Talk.
Thank you. Thank you, Zain.
Let's get to the first question. You guys are both BRI experts, the Belt and Road Initiative, and promoters of the Multipolar Alliance. Jeff, since you're an expert on this subject, I want to ask you the first question. Are you looking at geopolitics in the way, do you see a multipolar world emerging, or do you still believe that the world is unipolar at the moment?
Well, we can go back to Bandung in 1955 when basically the South, the countries of the South, China met to. That was basically the start of this idea of a multipolar world. And then, of course, if we would just respect the United Nations, but you'll never hear the Europe and the United States, NATO, the Five Eyes. They never talk about the United Nations. They always talk about allies and partners. So this is for me, what like Matt is talking about. The BRI is a catalyst. It's a backbone for the anti-Bretton Woods. I mean, I think most of the world's countries and peoples are tired of what I call the Bretton Woods, IMF, World Bank dictatorship, and they are looking for multipolarism. They are looking for, when China goes and visits Tuvalu, the little tiny island, island country in the Pacific, when like the foreign minister goes and visits these little tiny countries, and even Xi Jinping and other Chinese dignitaries, they look upon these little tiny countries as equals to China in terms of their culture, their history, and their economic wants and needs. And so I think it's happening. It's frustrating. The Western Empire is like the ogre under the bridge, and it's just relentless in its destructive capacities. But it's happening, and the BRI is, like I say, a wonderful skeleton to build off of, from Asia to Africa to Oceania, all the way over to South America. It's unfortunate the United States is not participating. It's happening, and we'll just, right now we'll just have to keep working at it. Russia and Iran just signed. I'm sorry, China and Iran just signed a big deal. Russia and China are in
$400 billion
economically, and $400 billion. Yeah, I think it was intentional that the China-Iranian deal was $400 billion, which is the exact same amount as the first China-Russia deal, the Power of Siberia gas. I think that was a sort of an elliptical message to the West, that this is all tied together. So.
Well, also on that same note, the Russians and Iranians have been also negotiating a similar $400 billion deal now for over a year. So again, that brings it together as the trifecta is concerned.
But these things take time. I mean, Iran and China started on this in 2016. these are major development plans, and so it's good that Russia and Iran are going to be doing the same thing, but it's not going to happen this year. I mean, they have country desks and energy and agriculture and science and education and medicine. They have all these different desks, and committees that work together. So maybe in
Jeff,
3 or
like
4
if
years,
we ask
Russia
you,
and Iran will.
if we ask you, you see a post-COVID world being a multipolar world?
Yeah, eventually, yes. Eventually, the big problem right now is Europe's and the United States' ability to print oceans of money, trillions of dollars out of thin air. As long as they can keep doing that, that's going to put a break on multipolarism. That's why Russia and China, are working on trying to, increase cross-border trade using their own currencies, avoiding the dollar. A lot of people are trying to bail out of the dollar, but the euro's not much better, but yeah, right now what's holding it up is the ability of the United States to control the financial world with the dollar as the reserve currency. So that's got to be weakened further and further over as the years pass.
What is the multipolar alliance? Explain a little more about that, and what is an alternative to the unipolar system centered in the transatlantic? You start, Matthew.
Yes, most certainly. Well, in short, the world has increasingly become split into two sort of separate views on how to organize the world. But since the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, there was an idea that we had reached the end of history, that there was a unipolar age, that the Cold War age of bipolarity was over. And really, it was just a matter of consolidating power centered in the transatlantic. Now, since Xi Jinping's announcement in 2013 of the Belt and Road Initiative, there's been what I like to call a survivors alliance. So this is something in the late 90s that began to form of nations in Eurasia, Russia, and China, specifically organizing a different view. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization grew out of this process, the G20, but it was growing somewhat slowly until that 2013 speech, when all of a sudden you had an acceleration, where there was an idea that the regime change policies, the idea of destabilizing weaker nations for the benefit of hegemony in the West was no longer tolerable. And Russia, China, and then a grouping of increasingly more and more nations began to jump on board with the Belt and Road Initiative as a new policy of supporting sovereign nation states and creating a new international foreign policy centered around what China describes as a win-win program of cooperation, long-term investments, new economic infrastructure set up that's outside of the World Bank and IMF influence to fund long-term development. And the idea was that it would benefit rich, poor, all players in various ways who would participate, and it would be open, not exclusive as the Western systems were, like NATO, but rather open for all to join increasingly, as we've now seen for the past 8 years.
Matthew, the last 2 weeks has seen an incredible acceleration of positive developments in the wake of the disastrous U.S. sabotage of China-U.S. relations in Alaska, and Biden's earlier claims that Putin is a soulless killer. Could you go over quickly some of these major developments and say something about how China and Russia are transforming the nature of their relationship?
Yeah, yes, I can. I think going into the post-Trump presidential system, Russia and China did have an open mind. They did, and they have still maintained the view that they want to have olive branches sent to their seeming rivals. I mean, nations who describe themselves amongst the European and North American zone as their rivals, they've made the point that they see them as potential collaborators and partners. And they've been saying that for years. So despite the fact that we're being told one thing in the Western media, it's very different when you look at who's actually the aggressor in all of these things. But yeah, we had a complete insult of burning of diplomatic bridges from leading forces around Biden, who destroyed all open channels of dialogue in an honest way with Russia and China. We've seen similar things in Canada and in the EU. So coming out of that process, that disaster in Alaska, China and Russia announced on March 23rd, Russia-China joint statement on global governance, where they basically made the point that they have now become the grantors of justice and world peace. In that policy statement, they both made the point that they defend the principles of the UN Charter, which enshrines the respect for sovereign nation states as a core principle that's unnegotiable. And they will not just be obedient to the will of a select few. Then they also followed that up with there's been joint statements made by China and Russia and Iran on the Middle East reconstruction, on Syria specifically, on March 27th. You've had a 5-point initiative for security in Southwest Asia on March 30th that was announced as, again, a program for a policy doctrine of security and development around the BRI and extending BRI projects all across Southwest Asia, all the way into North Africa. And now you have increasingly what's called the Greater Eurasian Partnership, which was first unveiled in 2016, which is accelerated as of this week, where again, Lavrov, Putin have made the point that the Greater Eurasian Partnership is open to all. Even the EU can join. The Eurasian Economic Union obviously is going to be on board, and it's going to involve the entire, Mackinder heartland as one zone of mutual development and respect, in opposition to the Zbigniew-Brzezinski geopolitical views that have dominated that zone for the past century, which have tried to carve it up and keep the world divided and fighting amongst themselves so that all parts could be better dominated by a hegemon. So this is all very quickly in the last 3 or so weeks. Lavrov also met with leading figures in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, in Israel, as well as Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister. Not only went to Iran to solidify that $400 billion trade deal, which you guys discussed, but also went to Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, and really just got the point across that even though there has been disputes amongst Iran, Saudi Arabia, and various parts in Qatar, there's a new way of thinking that's going to be beneficial to everybody. You don't have to play that game anymore, and you can all still be a part of this new system. So that's all very quickly, and it's accelerating very fast.
Tell us a little more about the projects in the Middle East regarding China and countries in the Middle East.
Well, China, under the BRI, people are very familiar with some of these images of the east-west transport corridors that China has built and are being built that connect to Europe, that obviously run directly through the Middle East with various transport hubs going through either, we have one hub going through Pakistan into an extension into Kabul, and then onward into other regions of Iran and beyond. You have some that go a little bit more north directly, transit more through Kazakhstan, through Russia. But there's so many, it's a very flexible design. It's not fixed. It's open to creativity. But what we have had, now that Iran is on board, Iran will be providing a lot of oil for the first time to China. Iran has not been providing oil. I think they've been supplying something like 3% of China's energy needs or oil needs of imports. Saudi Arabia has been supplying 16% up until now, but with the New Deal, Iran will be supplying a lot more, but in favor, they will be getting Chinese investment into hard infrastructure with a focus on, again, energy refineries, transport will be key, building new cities. China's already built hundreds of new cities. And some of these projects that, for example, Turkey has realized that their future is less with NATO and the EU that it had been formally wiring itself to join the EU for quite a number of years, and now they're looking again at what is this Titanic that they've been trying to join, and they're realizing there's not much of a future there. And Erdogan has been increasingly speaking very positively about the BRI. And when you look at things like Turkey's Middle Corridor program of a lot of rail, a lot of high speed, It's very synergistic with the BRI. They're welcoming a lot of Chinese investment, and that's going to be growing by the day. A lot of even, Russia is jumping on with what they can contribute as far as S-400s and other military defensive systems that a lot of these countries, including Saudi Arabia, are looking into. Turkey is building. Many others, Syria has been looking into, which really is a statement to the West that it's not just economic, it's not just military, it's all one thing. And they're not doing it aggressively. They're doing it as a way to create a new framework, a new architecture where you respect the sovereignty of your neighbor and you focus your energy on long-term common interests. And this is leading up to the upcoming Arab summit with the Chinese, and the Russians will be there as well, which looks very interesting. So yeah, there's many projects that you look at. If you look at Syria, if you look at Yemen, if you look at Iraq, if you look at Afghanistan, there's a lot of development projects that the Chinese have been looking at, have been increasingly expressing a willingness to fund, also across North Africa, for real reconstruction. And there's no other way other than the Chinese method to really offer peace, stability in that region, because the West has had a chance for decades and they haven't done it.
Jeff, you're a scholar on the subject. You're you've written a lot. I want to ask you this question, and I've always thought about it. You look at countries who've left the camp of the West and they came close with other countries, and they've let go of the United States policies. We look at Venezuela. We look at countries like Iran. And those countries are very close with Russia and China. But their economy has been it's been destroyed. Their currency is weak. In the future, if there is a country who wants to get up and be like, okay, I want to say bye-bye to the Western Alliance, I want to join Russia and China, what do they have to offer? What do they look at? Do they look at Venezuela as the example?
That's a really good question. The problem is that, going back, we can go back, 100 years.
My basic question is, like, does China or Russia or like the other countries have some sort of a system, economic support system, where if countries want to join this new alliance, they'll be supported and they won't end up like Venezuela?
Well, yeah, when you look at what's happened to countries, like any communist, socialist, anti-imperialist country is going to be in a constant state of war with the West, with Western Empire. I've read statistics where hundreds of billions of dollars have been sucked out of the Cuban economy since 1959. Where would Cuba be today if they had all that money and all that investment? And when you see what they've done, in spite of being attacked relentlessly for 70 years, is pretty impressive. Right now, China does have the BRI. China's foreign ministry is unbelievable. When you go online and look at who they go visit and who they go see, it's just mind-boggling. They go to the tiniest countries and visit these countries and cultivate relationships with them. So I would say right now, at least, other than this overarching idea of the BRI, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the European, the Eurasian Economic Union, et cetera. I mean, BRICS is pretty much defunct right now with Brazil and India. But right now, I think it's more bilateral. China is just going out and just meeting countries that the U.S. Department of State couldn't even probably find on a map. And so it's something worth pondering. Can Russia, China, Iran, and I like to call it the Quad, although with DPRK, although DPRK has such an independent foreign policy for very good reason. historical reasons. But yeah, could it be, could, excuse me, could Russia and China begin to coalesce maybe with Iran and, come up with some sort of a nexus for countries like Bolivia and Ecuador and Venezuela and Cuba and others to rally around? It's a good point, but I would say right now, for the most part, it's China doing their bilateral work, and then Russia doing their bilateral, as Matt has mentioned.
Matt, Biden has recently stated that he wishes to create a U.S.-led alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative. What does this look like? What does he have in mind? How do you think it look like? Have you read something about this?
I did hear that as well during a discussion that he had with Boris Johnson, saying that we need to create a Chinese, an American-led rival to China's BRI, to do what the BRI does, but better, and win over all of these countries that are in need. I don't, I mean, I laughed when I read that, because when you look at what the US has to offer, what are they bringing to the table other than decades of regime change and a basket case economy of deindustrialized? I mean, they used to have an industrial competent economy decades ago, but then, you had a bunch of assassinations in the 1960s of pro-industrial nationalist leaders. And the US has since then become a consumer society basket case where Wall Street and speculation has become the economy instead of producing for the long term. So they're bringing now a bubble economy that's ripe to blow to the table. That's what they have to offer. And a US military posture against Russia and China, two nuclear powers, which nobody wants to be caught in the crossfire of that type of war. So what is he thinking? I think that part of the outline of what this kind of looks like in their discombobulated fantasy world is what John Kerry is promoting going into India and Bangladesh this week between April 1st and April 11th. So it's sort of like the Kerry is providing as a U.S. special envoy on climate. He's providing him and Blinken a separate counter response to the Lavrov-Wang Yi approach to foreign policy. And it's a disaster. I mean, he's going into India and Bangladesh saying that they need to greenify their economy in accordance with the Paris Climate Accords. There has been since 2018 an anti-green BRI doppelganger called the OSAWOG, the One Sun, One World, One Globe agenda, with the subcaption, "The Sun Never Sets," sponsored by the World Bank and the Commonwealth, the British Commonwealth, which India is still a part. And so the fact that they call it "The Sun Never Sets," they say, oh, it has nothing to do with the British Empire. This is just because, everywhere in the world, there's always parts of the world receiving sunlight, so we could spread solar panels everywhere and then replace fossil fuels and nuclear power with solar panels. That's why we call it "Sun Never Sets." It has nothing to do with the British Empire. It's like, I'm sorry, no. The OSAWOG is built around, and this is, I think, the direction that they're going in. It doesn't work, and it reminds me of this episode of South Park. Sorry for the lowbrow reference, but there was an episode of this show called South Park that's a terrible show, but they had this funny skit where there's these underpants gnomes that are just trying to steal everybody's underpants. And then they bring them into this underground industrial center where they're collecting underpants. And these kids, the main characters, are like, why are you doing this? And these little underpants are like, the gnomes they explain, well, it's to make profit. It's part of our 3-phase plan. Phase 1, steal underpants. Phase 2, Phase 3, profit. And they're like, what's Phase 2? And all of these gnomes are like, what's Phase 2? We never thought about it. And when you look at the OSAWOG plan, it's very much similar because it's built up into 3 phases. Phase 1 is, you just spread solar panels all over Southwest Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. And then you integrate that grid with solar panels. Phase 2, you do the same thing in North Africa. And then you connect the two. And then Phase 3, you extend these grids to the whole world, and now the whole world will no longer be on fossil fuels or nuclear. And you meet the Paris Climate Accords by 2050. You've decarbonized, success. They skip such steps. It's like really obviously an ivory tower mathematician sitting there in a blackboard with no consideration of what the industrial needs are of society, or what the BRI is, or what is physical reality. It's just mathematical. So it might look good maybe on paper for some of these people, but it doesn't work. It can't be funded. Nobody wants to work with the U.S. on such a thing anyway. But if the U.S. could do it, what I make always as a point is if they were able to revive their lost constitutional traditions of John F. Kennedy, Franklin Roosevelt, McKinley, Lincoln, if they could revive that tradition, then having a type of U.S. BRI would be a great thing. It would be completely synergistic with China. It would be the U.S. investing in long-term needs of nations that have been wronged. That would be awesome. But right now, they're in no position to do that.
Jeff, while Matt was giving his analysis, something just came to my mind. Russia and Ukraine seem to be in a lot of tension, and Biden just got in the office. Does this reflect his policies geopolitically, and what is happening between Russia and Ukraine and NATO?
Since to cut straight to the chase, I think what's going on with NATO and the Ukraine is Nord Stream 2. I think this is a way to sabotage Nord Stream 2 and to prevent Russia connecting its massive Baltic Sea gas line directly to Germany. NATO's really ramping up, the war hype with Russia. And this is because of the Navalny, Alexei Navalny, this CIA, George Soros, National Endowment for Democracy, media creation. He has 2.5% of the vote in Russia. The communists have like 30%, and Putin's United Russia has something like 55%. He's a joke in Russia, but but that's okay for the West because they wanted to use him as a straw man in order to try to stop Germany from connecting the Nord Stream 2. That failed. He is now in jail for violating his parole. And so what else does the West do best? War. And so this is again another way to stop Nord Stream, because now they've got Russian ships working on Nord Stream, and they and German industrialists want this Russian gas like yesterday. It's much cheaper. It is much more reliable than Emirati liquefied natural gas or liquefied natural gas from Texas or Louisiana. It's much cheaper, and it doesn't go through Ukraine, which is being paid $2 to $3 billion a year for transit fees with the current line going between Russia and Europe. So they're really ramping it up. But I tell you what, I think they have 47,000 soldiers from the Baltics all the way down to the Ukraine. Ukraine has been blessed with a message of support from U.S. DoD Secretary Asher. He just this very, very, very similar. The very similar message to what was given to Georgia in 2008. A similar message to take back Donetsk and Lugansk, these two breakaway republics in eastern Ukraine, and even to take back Crimea. It's ridiculous.
But why now? Why now in Ukraine, and how do you think this is going to play off? Why now in Ukraine, and how do you think it's going to?
Because they are this close to connecting Nord Stream 2. They are this close. I mean, they're like a few kilometers, off the coast of Denmark and into Germany. I mean, it's so close you can almost smell it. And so this is just another. It's going to eventually happen because Germany is one of the most industrialized countries in the world, and German industry wants that gas, and they'll eventually get it. this is just going to be another delay, like the Navalny false flag when he was supposedly poisoned and all this other stuff. And it's putting off the eventuality. And so that's why when Navalny went back to Russia and got arrested, for violating his parole, Germany said, "Fine, let's get this darn thing built," and so, Merkel wants it, German industry wants it. Germany got rid of their nuclear. They've got only so much wind. Yeah. They need this gas like you wouldn't imagine. I mean, they got to have it to even be able to function over the next 10 years for their industrial needs. So, incredibly, the United States and Western Empire are ready to frame Russia because they own the Western media. They'll frame it. The big lie propaganda machine will roll out and say that Russia started it. Ukraine will probably do something to get the Russians to move into the Donbass that are now under attack. I wish they would roll all the way down to Odessa and the Black Sea, because that whole eastern 1/3 of Ukraine is essentially Russian. I mean, they're Russian people.
Matt,
so Russia will react.
Matt,
go ahead.
Matt, as Jeff was just saying, do you think that things are going to get out of hand, or there's going to be any escalation? How do you see things?
Well, I would add something to Jeff's point that I think he made as an incredibly important point, that this is really, I mean, the Nord Stream 2 is a big driver in this process, but also, and I will address your question directly, but the Mittelstand in Germany, the small and medium businesses and industrialists, that, I mean, it's one of the few places where there's still a productive power. France has a bit too. A lot of it's been nation stripped across Europe, though. They have clout, they have political clout and influence. So that's something which the empire has largely been a little bit concerned about. Not by a little bit, I mean a lot, to the point that Matt Pottinger in the US gave a threat directly in the Wall Street Journal, saying to US businesses, you have to now pick China or the US, you can't pick both, and it had better be the US. They're putting a lot of focus on the private sector, which remains a sort of unofficial diplomatic channel for BRI Russian collaboration, where a lot of these people who have, access to billions of dollars, a lot of productive capabilities, machinery, see that they have an interest. If they're US based or Canada based or European based, they have an interest in working with this future oriented Eurasian partnership. So right now, a lot of these geopoliticians are working very hard to try to shut down those business channels everywhere that they can. The Nord Stream 2 is a big one in terms of integration of common interest of Germany and other European nations into the Russian dynamic. So yeah, that's a big reason. Remind me, what was your specific question just now, though, because I slipped it off.
I was talking about escalation between Russia and Ukraine.
Okay. Yeah, that could very well happen. I mean, we saw that in 2008 under the Georgian situation. Luckily, Georgia, which was offered certain promises by Dick Cheney and the West, they didn't get that support that they needed when they launched an attack on South Ossetia, which resulted in a lot of deaths. But that was a 5-day war. It ended pretty quickly, and they weren't part of NATO. Ukraine is also not part of NATO, but they're putting, this time around, 13 years later, a lot more interest and support behind Ukraine. They've got a major defend Europe military policy exercise going on right now. Victoria Nuland is back in charge, so we're seeing a re-inflammation of a lot of the National Endowment for Democracy subversives in Ukraine, conducting covert operations, including what looks to be like a false flag. Recently, a firefight a few weeks ago, where they're blaming the Donbass militias for having killed 4 Ukrainian servicemen. Yeah. But experts on the ground from Europe haven't been able to find any evidence that this firefight even happened. So it seems to be more of this Gulf of Tonkin false flag repetition as part of a propaganda operation for the Westerners who believe the media. Could this escalate? It might, because at this point, we have an empire which has consolidated its power for decades, which is rotting away, and you have an alternative new system growing at a faster rate every day. I don't think that they can blow out their financial system in the West if they don't eliminate what they believe to be their rivals of Eurasia. So I think that there is an increased danger of somebody doing something crazy, honestly, and perhaps escalating it to make it seem as though the Russians are instigators, but in reality, they're defending themselves. And this could get hot. There's also the same thing Lavrov has pointed out, the full spectrum dominance has been underway since 2007 or even earlier, but this is now accompanied by this same policy around China's perimeter too, which is also increasing with British, French military ships joining the Straits of Taiwan and other waters around China. As far as freedom of navigation protocols are concerned, they're just all pushing on China's backyard and being very inflammatory. So I don't know. It's very dangerous, though.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Would you like to add something?
I think if Russia just goes in and secures those rebel areas of the Donbass in Donetsk and Lugansk, I think NATO will do what they did to Mikhail Saakashvili and Georgia, and just cutting, let him, get humiliated by the Russian army. However, is it possible that Russia may, go beyond what are the current rebel areas, like I was talking about, to maybe secure more of a buffer zone? If they did that, then it could be that NATO might try to get involved. I mean, they've got 47,000 soldiers all along the Russian border, doing these drills. And even if they didn't do it intentionally, there's so much room for error and misunderstanding and mistakes and et cetera, false flags, as Matt pointed out. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens if the Donbass does become a point of contention, and how much Russia responds and how much NATO responds. But I think NATO's scared to death of Russia, the Russian army. I think NATO is scared. I think they peeing in their pants if the thought of having to go up against the Russian army. I don't think they want to mess with them. I mean, I think they know what they would be up against. So we'll see what happens.
Jeff, like we were discussing, what sort of an alternative economic structure does this alliance have? Both Russia and China have repeatedly said they need to reduce their reliance on the US dollar for international trade settlements. Many of their infrastructure projects that are connecting different countries in the BRI, outside the BRI, they're planning on not trading using the US dollar. They're not planning to rely on the US dollar. So how do you see this move building up? Do you see it's going to work?
Well, it will eventually work, but getting two central banks to harmonize their business together, it's like getting an elephant and a hippopotamus to dance the waltz. You would think that it would just be so easy, they would just get together and, kind of, but good banks are very conservative. They're very methodical. They err on the side of safety. That would include the Russian central bank, and that would include the Chinese central bank, the People's Bank of China. They have been talking about a CRIFT, a China-Russia interbank, financial transfer system like the Bank of International Settlements. that the U.S. essentially controls in Switzerland that runs the SWIFT, which we all send our wires by SWIFT. The cross-border trade between Russia and China is, I mean, a few years ago it was 2%, and then it was 8% in their local currencies. It's up to about 25% now. I think what's after Alaska and all these threats, you know, to cut Russia out of the SWIFT, interbank system, almost like a sanction against them. I think they're going to really be working hard to get this crift, maybe to get that elephant and that hippopotamus to dance sooner than they would rather want to. Because, you know, if you can't pay your bills and you can't get paid, you know, they may have to become less conservative and really ram it through. The most exciting thing, of course, is that China has a government digital currency. They basically took digital currency. They kicked out Bitcoin and Ethereum and all these others, and they essentially nationalized the digital currency in China for the benefit of the people. They have very methodically been working on this. They're now working with the United Arab Emirates. They're working with Thailand, and they're working with a couple of other countries to test their digital currency across borders with other banking systems. Unlike Bitcoin and Ethereum, it will be benchmarked to some kind of a currency. I think they might even go with the IMF's special drawing rights, because it would have less fluctuation than even the Chinese yuan. But if they can get this going, that completely cuts out the BIS and SWIFT. China is also, but again, this takes time. I mean, this is not going to happen this year. And they'll try it probably with Chile, and they'll try it with Ethiopia, and they'll try it with some of their other countries in the BRI to try to get this digital currency going, which would be completely anonymous from the West. China has also essentially nationalized blockchain technology. And by the way, China will sell their digital currency to banks for currency, so that other banks can also, private banks and Chinese publicly owned banks, can start using this digital currency. That's probably going to be another 2 or 3 years down the road. They also have essentially nationalized blockchain technology to keep the bad guys out. And so if they can integrate the blockchain technology for trade, blockchain is essentially an account on the cloud where you and I can access it and no one else can. It's unhackable. Instead of you having your books and I'm having my books here and we're trying to reconcile them, we reconcile our accounting online in an unhackable account. So if they can get this going, they are doing a lot of blockchain right now. I would say it's going to be probably 3 to 5 years before this really starts taking on some amplitude and having an international impact. I don't know what Matt thinks about the timeline, but I'd say 3 to 5 years.
Matt,
yeah, I don't know.
How realistic do you think this is?
I don't know. I mean, it's difficult to talk about the future when you're living at the at a sort of shock front of a systemic breakdown. And I do see that in my assessment of the current banking system that is centered in the London Wall Street axis, there is a bubble that's been stretched beyond limits and that's been inflated, hyperinflated, some could say, with constant liquidity injections beyond reason. The debt has skyrocketed by tens of trillions of dollars under the COVID lockdowns. So there's no physical ability to produce wealth sufficient to justify these higher and higher rates of debt incurred. So I think a wave of defaults is something which one could expect to see if you don't get a systemic change happening relatively soon. We're on, in my mind, a bit of borrowed time. So yes, I mean, to the degree that you can linearly, continuously extend the rate of change into the future as we have experienced it over the past years, you could talk about, maybe in 2, 3, 4 years this could happen, but you got to think, well, okay, if we have that breakdown shock front now snap, what type of accelerating rate of change are you going to see? Is somewhat difficult since we're in very much new territory, and I think we could have changes for the very good happening at faster rates than people realize, or for the very bad, based on the chaos factor and the confusion factor that tends to happen, where only a few who are perhaps near the top of the pyramid are able to sort of try to manage the chaos. And I think that Xi Jinping, Putin, a lot of leading statesmen around the world are very aware of this imminent breaking point, and they also are looking at setting in place a viable framework as life rafts for nations who currently are not willing or aware that they should be joining this new win-win process. I think they're trying to create a situation where it would be as easy as possible and organic as possible to make that shift happen. Whereas again, under the current framework, it's difficult for me to talk about the future.
Thank you so much, Jeff J. Brown, for being on Tactical Talk. It was a pleasure having you. This was Jeff J. Brown, an author and also the editor of China Rising Radio, Sinoland, and China Tech News. And also Matthew Ehret joining us from Canada. He is a journalist and also a geopolitical analyst. We were discussing the multipolar alliance. Until the next episode of Tactical Talk, keep on watching Tactical Talk. This is Zain Khan. Take care. Goodbye.